It feels like we spend a lot of time in politics circling the drain these days, talking about integration or civilizational renewal or our values, and all of these conversations are moot if our people can't secure a future for our own children. And I've felt this way even before becoming a dad, but as the kids are arriving in October, a little bit earlier than the due date, I am driven by wanting to avert a terrible fate which awaits them, and that fate is forecasted by the latest round of statistics about birth rates in Britain from the ONS. This was released last week, and it says under the main point summary, there were 585,396 live births in England and Wales in 2025. That's a 1.6% decrease from 594,677 in 2024, so birth rates on the whole are declining. This is the lowest fertility rate in England and Wales since records began in 1938. The total fertility rate has decreased from 1.41 children per woman in 2024 to 1.39 in 2025, with the final rates to be released later in 2026. But the most alarming statistic is the number of live births where either one or both parents were born outside of the UK has increased by 0.7 percentage points in 1 year, from 39.5% in 2024 to 40.2% in 2025. Now, this is the highest since records began in 1969, and it's a 5.8% increase since 2021, and this is, of course, thanks to the Boris wave of 5.6 million immigrants now who entered the country between 2020 and 2026. So we've had about 6 million immigrants in 6 years, because remember, a few hundred thousand are still have poured in since the last round of statistics were gathered and then published in the last week or so. In this article, they point out that the rise in newborns with at least one parent born abroad now equates to more than 235,000 of the 585,396 births in the last year. So 40% of children born in Britain have a foreign-born parent. Bear in mind, that doesn't factor in second or third generation immigrants, which are counted as British-born despite not being one of us. Estimates show that Indian migrants have a fertility rate a fifth higher than British nationals, West Africans 50% higher, and Pakistanis roughly twice as high, according to 2024 estimates by the birth country of mothers. Doesn't estimate according to fathers, because of course you don't necessarily know who the father is, especially in cultures like this that have a higher rate of infidelity. You might be thinking, hold on a minute, that's about 50% of the younger generation who are non-British, but I thought that we had until 2063 until the white British were a minority in their one and only homeland. Well, having run the numbers, it turns out if you look at the pace of change in foreign origin parent births and non-white British births between 2007 and 2026, so almost a 20-year period, if you extrapolate that trend out, then my two children are going to be a minority in their own generation by 2031. 5 years. We've got 5 years. We've got 5 years until our kids, born now, kids of the millennials and zoomers, are going to be mistreated, hated minorities among their own peer group. Look at what's been done to us. It's just horrendous. And it's going to keep getting worse. And what wasn't disclosed in the ONS dataset summary, because you can get all the tables and charts, but it's easier to read when broken down, is the nation of origin producing these children. Because it would be a bit different if the mothers were from Germany or Japan. It would be different if the immigrant parents were from high trust, intelligent, respectful, proximate cultures. You know, even then I would still have an issue with the overall rate of demographic churn, cultural change, you know. I like the Poles, but I can't be constantly told about Polish history every 5 minutes. They're sort of competing with cyclists and vegans to tell you that they're Polish. Nevertheless, that's not the case. Because the lead nations that are producing these children with foreign-born parents, as LBC lays out in this article, is India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Romania. Now remember, Romania is not always Romanians. Many of them are gypsies. So India is the most common country of birth for non-UK born mothers in 2025. That's the 4th year in a row it took the top spot. That just so happens to be the 4th year in a row where Indians are also the largest nation providing legal migrants to Britain. About 250,000 Indians came in every year under the Boris wave and the Rishi wave. Of course, I'm sure it's just pure coincidence that the Home Secretary at the time, Priti Patel, Hindu, from India. Sure, it's just a coincidence that Rishi Sunak, Hindu, from India, also wrote a report in 2014 saying that the government should take in more Indian migrants because they're more likely to vote Conservative. Pure coincidence. I'm sure that our immigration system is ethnically gerrymandered by the sons and daughters of the Indian subcontinent. And if you look at specific areas, I mean, it's just bleak. London Borough of Harrow was the local area with the highest percentage of births to a non-UK born mother. That's 78%. While the Isle of Anglesey in Wales had the lowest, 4.7%. But where in Harrow it says 78%, that doesn't necessarily mean there is a holdout of 22% of white Brits still having kids. That just means that there might be second or third generation Indian parents who are also having kids there. So it could well be there isn't a single white British baby being born in some of the regions of our country. And this is a serious logistical concern, because let's say that you are doing your best to reverse our dire demographic circumstances. Let's say you're fortunate enough, like me, to live around extended family who are happy to help out raising them. You know, they can't wait to be grandparents and even great-grandparents. But none of your peer group live around you. None of your friends are having kids yet, or those that are, they live far away. Who do my kids play with? Who do they spend their time with? I don't want to send them to a school. And it's not just the curriculum, you know, seeking to pervert them and ideologically brainwash them, and also just deprive them of raw contact hours with their parents who love them and know what's best for them. I don't want them to go to a school where they are going to be a minority in their own classroom, and where natural tribalism will kick in, and there will be ethnic factionalism, and even if not in their school, in other schools, ethnic gangs that will target them on the most superficial of characteristics, and because they've been taught by the school curriculum that they have been marginalised and oppressed by my ethnic group for decades, and now it's time to get revenge. And this is the fate awaiting our kids. And we can just see it coming in the raw figures. It's actually easier to visualize thanks to graphs provided by Charlie Cole on X. You should go and follow him. It's at Charlie Cole CC. He's also provided me with some of the bespoke graphs that he created specifically for this video, so thank you very much, sir. Here's prior to the post-war baby boom. We had a 1.84 fertility rate, so it was slightly down. Boomed above replacement rate in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then you see the introduction of the birth control pill, and coinciding with the legalization of abortion and the 1970s oil shock, so the first big economic crisis in the post-war period, and ever since we haven't recovered. Our birth rate has been dipping below sub-replacement. Now that's the same in Japan, Germany, Italy, so it's not just these monocausal explanations, like the decline of Christianity, it's not just economic circumstances, it's not just birth control or abortion, because birth control is far less common to be used in Japan. But we're currently at a fertility rate of 1.39, and that's a total fertility rate, which means the fertility rate for white Brits is even lower, because it's not broken down by ethnicity, because trying to get that data from the government is like pulling teeth. If you look at the percentage of births in England and Wales to foreign-born mothers, it was 11.7% in 1969, and it gradually ticks up in the mid-70s, when, of course, you had large quantities of Pakistani and Indian immigration between the 50s and 70s. Even still, it was only a few thousand, but that was a mistake. And then you get to 1997, and it starts creeping up quite drastically, and then you see the spike between 2021 and 2025, when it goes up by 6% in less than 6 years. If you look at the ethnic breakdown, not just whether or not their parents are born abroad, white British births were 53%. We are within 3% of becoming dead even with people who have other nations to call home, establishing their families in our country. Oh, and despite what you might believe by adverts and all of their diversity requirements, mixed parentage babies are only 7% of the population. So for all of the attempts to sort of push that as a strategy on the public, by Boris Johnson no less in his recent Mail article, most people just prefer to have their kids look like them. And I'll be very happy that my kids will resemble me. And that's a natural desire, and you shouldn't be shamed for that. Charlie also created a chart that shows births in England and Wales by broad ethnic categories, so white, black, Asian, which isn't all that helpful. Ethnic data is much more precise when broken down by ethnic origin and nationality as well. If you look at the line of 2021, you can see that white births precipitously declined from 70.5% to 62.8% within that 5 to 6 year period. And that's, of course, because of the composition of migration changing from Poles and Germans and Swiss to Indians, Pakistanis, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, R.I.P. Rhodesia, and Ghanaians. And now we're just seeing the most precipitous decline, not just in our culture and our demographics, but also just the aesthetics of the country. Because if you touch down at Heathrow Airport now, you'd be forgiven to think that you'd got on the wrong flight, and you landed in Bangalore or Lahore or Lagos instead. And it is totally fine to say that you want to live among your own people, because there's a sort of comfort blanket that comes with being around people that you can predict. You understand how they think. You will understand their behavior almost as much as knowing the sun will rise tomorrow. And that's why, back in the 60s, when we saw first bout of serial killings with the Myra Hindley and Ian Brady case, that's why it was such a shock to the collective psyche. I think Morgoth had an excellent article on this. And now there's just the conveyor belt of atrocities we see in the headlines every day, because people with completely different cultures and ways of thinking that we cannot hope to comprehend, we don't know their motives, they just do horrendous things to our people on a daily basis, to the point where it just becomes the white noise of managed decline. To hear that another child has been abducted, another son like Henry Novak has been murdered, another girl has been brutalized by a Pakistani drug gang, and this thing will just become more common. If you think that we're second-class citizens now, just wait until we're no longer a demographic majority. Because the state has been very keen to afford imported minorities a position of privilege over us, despite the disproportionate violent crimes they're committing against us. Imagine when they have demographic might. I don't think those vengeful feelings of long-standing ethnic and historical grievances, and their own ethnic chauvinism, I don't think those feelings will just dissolve out of pity for us being reduced to a minority in our own country. Charlie also did a version that provides a white British birth line on this, and there's not much commentary I can provide other than just saying this is a disaster, a predictable disaster we're hurtling towards, and almost none of our politicians want to do anything about it. Nobody's speaking in demographic terms. As of yet, no politician has been asked the question by Stephen Edgington. White British people are set to become a minority in their own country. What do you think of that? And answered, that's terrible. Nobody wanted this. Nobody voted for this. It must be stopped and reversed at all costs. That's the only acceptable answer. Because no other people would be expected to accept this. I mean, as I put to Melanie Phillips the other day when she wrote a very long piece decrying the blood and soil ethno-nationalism of Restore Britain and other online commentators, I just said, Melanie, if Jews were set to become a minority in Israel, would you expect them to take that? Or would you call upon them to do everything possible to avoid that fate? And if so, well then, you might understand why I want to do the same for my people too. For my children, specifically. Because they won't forgive us if we consign them to this fate. And then, as you can see, this is the decline in sheer percentage terms We have fallen by 13% of births in the last 15 years. 13% of our people have just been wiped off the map in 13 years. And here's a graph showing the gradual progression of this. You just see our size of the pie shrinking over time. It's like a demographic doomsday clock, counting down to our obsolescence in our own country. And we can already see some of the external characteristics of this. There's a Telegraph piece here that points out that there are maternity wards closing across London. The one I was born in, just up the road, has closed down quite some time ago, but the Royal Free Hospital in Camden said last year it would close its maternity unit because of plunging births, despite being one of the largest trusts in the country, and more than 40 schools have also closed since 2020, according to London councils. That includes predominantly primary schools. So the demographic effect will be more pronounced if you do send your kids to one of these schools, because the few children that are being had will be clustered in ever more crowded classrooms, I suppose. But also, if you are having children and you're living in an area that isn't essentially an enclave of your friends who are also having children, you haven't self-selected based on values and your desire to have a family for those around you, then your kid will be the only white British kid in the class. Will they even understand their peers who might not even speak English as a second language, let alone a first? This is just an appalling fate to condemn our children to. And of course you have the cheerleaders in The Guardian. I'm not even going to go through this article because it's boring. It makes the same sort of arguments. Headline is, of course, the right is desperate for a solution to falling birth rates. Who's going to tell them that the answer is immigration? No, it's not, because you can't substitute out your entire population with another and expect the nation to remain the same. The nation state is contingent on the nation, the people, to remain the same, to be recognisable. Nations are bound together by the vertical bonds of ancestry and the horizontal bonds of shared cultural inheritance and in-group solidarity. And if you break the vertical bonds of ancestry, you destroy those horizontal bonds, and the nation becomes undone. And it's almost like that's the goal. It's almost like that's the express purpose that The Guardian has in mind when it insists, well, if the numbers on the spreadsheet are falling, just substitute yourselves with sub-Saharan Africans and Indians instead. And by the way, that's not a particularly sustainable model, even if you were going to pursue it, because even India has sub-replacement birth rates now. I mean, you know, every silver cloud and all that. But why are these nations all falling? By 2100, it's going to be only 6 nations, I think, worldwide, 1 in Asia and 5 in Africa. According to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation research published in The Lancet about 2 years ago now. They're going to be the only countries in the world that have above replacement birth rates. And of course, the authors of that paper's solution was, well, every nation can just get their migrants from there, rather than encourage their own people to have children. Because, of course, the closed family, a sense of solidarity with your own in-group, a love of your own country, all of that is just a symptom of the authoritarian personality, and of course that's racist and how we ended up with Hitler. So you couldn't possibly have a wholesome society and a family of your own. No, you have to abandon those ambitions to save the climate for who exactly? But you got to wonder, why is this happening everywhere all at once? There was a viral Financial Times article written by John Byrne Murdoch, and he pointed out that there is a widening gap between the number of children that people say they would like and the number they actually have. So most countries find it ideal to have between 2 and 3 children. So if people had the children that they wanted, or like me were blessed with 2 at once, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. So why aren't people having that? Why are people succumbing to what Stephen Shaw has called the tragedy of unplanned childlessness? Leaving it too long, unable to find the right partner, not feeling financially secure enough to settle down, not having a house, which is pretty important to have a family. Why is it that birth rates have declined in the past 15 years across different cultures, different levels of economic development, different continents, different countries, and all sort of simultaneously? Is this a kind of species-wide ennui? Just checking out of continuing our own cultures and civilizations? Is it that capitalism and economic development is a kind of civilizational contraceptive? It did, as people have suggested after reading this article, Did smartphones and YouTube Shorts hit developing countries like an atom bomb? Well, there are some theories in this article. Of course, it says relationship rates among young adults declining around the world. That's because fewer people are socializing. It hasn't helped. The Me Too trend hasn't really helped, nor has the fact that everything's been filmed, and so any sort of earnest effort to approach someone can be immortalized as a source of embarrassment for you for all time. Those things haven't really helped relations between men and women. Neither has the ideological poisoning of young women against young men as documented in the New Statesman, because young women have a very hostile opinion of young men, whereas young men don't reciprocate. They actually quite like young women. They want to form families with them. NBC polling shows that even among young Republican-identified women, financial independence and career experience is more of a priority, whereas the number one priority ranked for Republican men is having a family. So there are mismatched expectations between young men and women. But is it technology? Are smartphones causing the birth rate decline? In the article it says, in more than 2/3 of the world's 195 countries, the average number of children born to each woman has fallen below the replacement rate of 2.1 that keeps populations stable without immigration. Populations are destabilized by immigration, because it's not the same population. In 66 countries, the average is now closer to 1 than 2. In some, the most common number of children born to each woman is 0. In South Korea, they have more dogs than they do children. And that's not because of the reason you're thinking. Both the pace and breadth of the decline are defying expectations. Just 5 years ago, the UN predicted there would be 350,000 births in South Korea in 2023. That was a 50% overestimate. The real figure was 230,000. And that's tragic because, South Koreans are actually very nice people, so I would quite like to see their country thrive, actually. Analysis of the data ranging from population records to Google searches indicates that although many factors contribute to falling birth rates, the most recent plunge is connected with our use of technology. Now, in the sex recession essay that was written in The Atlantic a few years ago, they did map falling rates of teenage pregnancy onto the rollout of internet across American states. So it is possible that contemporary digital distractions and the retreat from in-person socializing and being mentally present in social engagements as well, rather than just checking your phone, into your home, purely interfacing through digital means, has had a contraceptive effect. I mean, this, I don't want to overstate it, but if more people are spending more time online focused on their phones, then not only are they withdrawing from the relationships they're already born into, or may have already entered into by the time the smartphones came around. They might have already been married, and now you're getting people who are married but spend less time with their spouse because they're on social media. You're getting fewer people form those relationships in the first place because the raw number of hours that they're spending awake are spent on digital entertainment, doom scrolling, or it might just sap them of the motivation to go out and do things in the real world. Surrogate activities, I think, as Uncle Ted Kaczynski once said. It's kind of like the same effect as a guy watching porn and getting his sexual fix feels less motivated to go out and actually attract women, unless you're some sort of weird obsessive gooner like Hassan Piker. Same effect is that if you're getting your social fix vicariously through a surrogate activity like talking on a group chat or on a Discord forum, then you're less likely to go out and engage in social clubs, go out to bars. I know it's a very boomer thing, but go out and meet people in person, fall in love and find a spouse. Okay, that's potentially true, especially I think in the third world that have just gained access to TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube Shorts, and who you see, thanks to the enriching Boris wave, just sitting around on their phone, drinking coffee, smoking, playing these short-form obnoxious videos out loud in various languages. Passive consumption may well be a contraceptive. It says, almost all the world is now effective. Until recently, ultra-low and rapidly falling birth rates were primarily a concern for rich countries, but many developing countries now have lower fertility rates than the much wealthier ones. In 2023, Mexico's birth rate fell below that of the US for the first time, and subsequently did those of Brazil, Tunisia, Iran, and Sri Lanka. Lower and middle-income countries are now getting old before they're getting rich. And this has been suggested as a consequence of smartphones. You can see as smartphones take off, there is a additional precipitous decline in birth rates across the globe. This is according to UN World Population projections. Byrne Murdoch suggests the fertility gap between goals and outcomes are due to frictions and frustrations that have much to do with our modern lifestyles, including our homes and increasingly our phones. So, has social media hit the human race like the Krogan genophage? Well, according to Financial Times analysis, half of those countries' decline in fertility rates since the 90s can be explained by falling home ownership and a rise in young adults who live with their parents. I mean, if the average age of buying a home now in America is in your 30s, then it's kind of hard to settle down, get married, and have kids in your 20s, especially in Anglo-Protestant cultures. And Catholic, to be fair, because we banned cousin marriage in the 13th century. You're welcome for that. And we don't live in extended clan settings. We have more nuclearized family units, and it's been the sort of secret to our success in the Anglosphere and Northwestern Europe. Our high trust society, our extension of manners and moral consideration outside of the immediate family, and our ability, therefore, to have an entrepreneurial economy in a peaceful and prosperous country. You kind of need the ability to establish your own homesteads in order to have that. And based on mass migration causing unprecedented competition for housing in our countries, it's a lot harder to get that. Though, as Paul Morland has pointed out, fertility rates are still quite low in areas that have less expensive housing costs. The argument would be, of course, that there are fewer economic opportunities for young people in those areas, which is why the housing costs are lower. Unless you're working remotely on a London salary, it's hard to earn a living having a mortgage and being able to support multiple kids, especially as a single income provider if you're living in Hull or Merseyside. In here, they also point out it cannot account for the most recent steep decline or its global breadth. In Nordic countries, fertility has fallen despite economic stability, and a rise in the number of young adults living on their own rather than with parents or flatmates. And even when couples can afford to move into their own place, they're increasingly likely to separate. That's because they're often living together before they get married, a leading indicator of divorce, so don't do it. In several countries, people who move in together are now more likely to split up than to have a child, which is a sharp reversal of the historical norm. And this is partly contraceptives, because something that a lot of trads don't want to admit, frankly, is that about a third of the marriages in the past were just shotgun marriages. Couples would, often accidentally, conceive their children before they got married. It happened with one of my grandparents, and they were married until their recent death, almost 60 years of marriage. They had 4 kids. It happens with plenty of people's family members, and it did work. But the social pressure to get married, stay together, have a family in the home, and provide for your children was there. And now there's no external cultural pressure to do that, especially among certain communities. But let's take our own, for example. The majority of abortions in Britain are white British women. And this is because abortion is now used as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And it's because the babies themselves are seen as a punishment. A lifelong drudgery. An imprisonment from where you could otherwise, I don't know, be working for a soulless corporation that doesn't care about you and clubbing instead. So the cultural pressures cut against natalism. Our culture can't argue that a baby is valuable in and of itself, and is a worthy dependent that requires you make sacrifices for it, rather than you sacrifice it for your own adult desires. It can't justify unplanned pregnancies. And it also can't promote you to plan that pregnancy as something more valuable than the other factors you're weighing it against, like pure economic calculations. In the past, you didn't have to rationally plan your own family, it just sort of happened. It was a stage of life that was imposed upon you, and you adapted. This often happened, and I think Louise Perry actually provided this insight, by the way, as a natural life and death cycle. As your elders would age out, there's something in you that sort of prompts you to replenish the generational chain. And because of the extended life cycle of our baby boomer grandparents, and I'm not dumping on them for this, I would much rather my grandparents, my deceased grandparents, were still around to meet their great grandkids, but nevertheless, because they're living longer, we don't have that reminder of our own mortality, which then prompts us to do our duty to our family and our people by having kids. And all of these factors are less tangible than the material pressures that the Financial Times and other commentators discuss, because a lot of this is about subsidies. A lot of this is about material incentives for and against having children. But there's a lot to the conversation about civilizational ennui. there's a lot to the conversation about conceiving of yourselves as rational consumer beings, whereas other cultures, our own in the past even, just saw themselves as unconscious participants in a greater civilization, and they didn't need to question or rationalize the stages of life that they were going through, which provided them with meaning. And now we're almost relearning from first principles the reasons why those ways of being are best for us. And I've been asked recently, how do we fix the birth rate crisis? Other than just having kids of your own. It sounds like I'm grabbing for Scrabble tiles to try and make sense of this, but it's because there is something intangible but very important to the cultural element of this. And unless you are enmeshed in a community that supports you, and I mean a physical one, extended family and friends, that supports you in raising those children, unless you are willing to make the sacrifice because you value children in and of themselves, rather than weighing them up in equal measure against the things you consume, or the time you spend on leisure activities, or your economic security. Unless you do that, then you can never convince yourself to have kids. And that's quite a difficult realization, because there is no quick government fix to that long-lasting cultural change. You can change the incentives, you can lighten the burden of home ownership, you can ensure that young people are put first and prioritized in their own country again, that they have a sense of belonging, that the demographic trends that will make their children a minority in their own country are reversed. And we absolutely should do all of those things. But in order to replenish our own depleted population reserves, we have to start valuing our own kids again. And that's an individual endeavor. And that's an endeavor of raising consciousness, and that's an endeavor of keeping these discussions going. And that's also an endeavor of looking forward to raising your own children, even though things will be difficult. Like, being frank, I'm not looking forward to changing nappies and doing potty training and you know, reading the same dog goes bark, cat goes meow book over and over again. It's not exactly intellectually stimulating for me, but it's not for me. It's greater than me. It's more important than me. And so you have to kind of take that calling. Even if you have reservations or trepidations or concerns that you won't be up to the task. You need to do it. And another motivator is, who else is competing for your time and your attention? And it's social media companies, it's porn companies, it's physical predators who want to siphon away your attention, hijack your dopamine reward system, and line their pockets at the expense of your lineage. As Bern Murdoch writes, Nathan Hudson and Hernan Mosco Boedo of the University of Cincinnati published a paper last month looking at the birth rates through lens of the rollout of 4G mobile networks in the US and the UK. The number of births fell first and fastest in the areas that received high-speed mobile connectivity the earliest. Authors argue the smartphone has transformed how young people spend time with one another, sharply reducing in-person socializing and leading to the collapse in their fertility. FT research indicates the same trend has affected other countries. For example, US, British, and Australian birth rates for teens and young adults were broadly flat during the early 2000s, but began to markedly fall from 2007. The same slide began in France and Poland around 2009, Mexico, Morocco, and Indonesia around 2012, and what had been steady declines in fertility in Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal became precipitous drops between 2013 and 2015. Again, silver linings. All of these inflection points coincided with mass adoptions of smartphones in local markets, as measured by Google searches for mobile apps. In country after country, the birth rate plunged after the introduction of smartphones. No matter what the previous trend was, the younger the age group, the more pronounced the downturn, a mirror image of smartphone usage patterns. Doom scrolling is a displacement activity. And all the other things you're probably doing in your smartphone, other than, listening to nourishing podcasts like this one while you're doing something proper, like mowing your grass or doing the dishes, or, I don't know, farming spin foil on Destiny 1 if you're still in 2015. Why did I even make that reference? Unless you're listening to things that are actually nourishing your spirit and encouraging you to then put your earphones down and go out and do things in the real world and love your family and call your nan and have a garden. Unless you're doing that sort of stuff, then it's a total waste of time. It is an intellectual contraceptive. Among couples, sexual dysfunction is higher for the young adults with the heaviest social media usage, notes Finnish demographer Anna Rotkirch, and I would think that's because, to paraphrase Stefan Molyneux here, attention is porn for women and porn is porn for men. And so if you're constantly on the commodification carousel, looking at other people who are distorting your standards of attractiveness, of what you should be having in life, if you are incapable of partitioning your life from the public and private. You know, my wife doesn't have any facing social media at all, and I don't put anything really about my personal life on social media for that reason. I don't spend a lot of time on it, despite me constantly talking to you through your screen. If you can't do that, then it consumes your life and renders you incapable of having authentic in-person connections. Rot-Kirsch argues the time taken up by social media and the values and lifestyles such platforms project have made it harder for young adults to form committed relationships. Stanford University's Alice Evans adds that the more traditional a culture is in terms of its gender roles, the greater is the impact of smartphones on birth rates. And this is the most interesting part, because I think we're actually getting to the core cause here. The data bears this out. The Middle East and Latin America show many of the steepest birth rate falls of the past decade, and a recent study found that social media use is associated with lower fertility in sub-Saharan Africa. In South Asia, where women's web access is often more limited, fewer people remain single. Evans describes this as cultural leapfrogging, adding Instagram and TikTok enable young women across the world to bypass traditional authorities, raising their expectations for a relationship in a way their male counterparts are often not prepared for. FT researchers indicated the emerging ideological divide between young men and women is a smartphone-era phenomenon concentrated among the non-college educated. Among this cohort, women have moved leftward, men have not, and coupling and births have cratered. The demographic decline we are facing, the fact that my children are going to become a minority in my own country, is a consequence of increasing female agency. And that's a difficult conversation to have, because nobody in a liberal framework, at least, feels that confiscating hypothetical options from broad categories like men and women are palatable. Because everyone should be equal. Everyone should be able to make the use of their talents. But what I think, and I said this to David Starkey, what I think is happening with the liberal framework is it's forcing somewhere people who live according to habits and customs and traditions and don't have grand expectations out of life, good people, nevertheless, it's forcing somewhere people to live as if they were anywheres. It's forcing them into an anywhere mold. And they're very uncomfortable with that. Because most people are rooted. They want to live in concentric circles of family and community, neighbors, congregation, and nation. They want their life to be the same day in, day out. They want creature comforts. They want the working man's club or a book club or a sewing circle, something like that. And so when you strip mine those third places out, when you close down the pubs, when you break apart their traditional industries, when you move their social networks to online, which has no physical architecture, it's a weird comment to make. When you feel like you're interfacing with your phone, it feels like you're actually talking to a portal to another dimension which has no physical space in it. It's quite disembodying for many people. When you do that to most people, they don't make best use of these new hypothetical infinite options. They instead become lost. They become slaves to the algorithm and consumer products and perverse financial incentives. You cause them to succumb to addictions and deaths of despair. You discourage chivalry from men. You discourage loyalty from women. And so you discourage family formation. You encourage abortions. You encourage meaningless, idle consumerism. And that's why you get the disparity in expectations. Women would like to gorge themselves on this hypothetical buffet of limitless options because rather than have to commit to one man who provides them all the attention, resources, and security that they had to traditionally, they can instead diffuse their attention to multiple sources of validation. Whereas men have lost their traditional role and purpose in life to find a wife, be a pillar of the community, protect their children, provide for them, make sacrifices, and have the sliver of their disposable income, spent on like a shed or a personal project or something. Men actually like that. There's going to be lots of people in the comments going, "Oh, you're going to consign men to a fate of domestic servitude based on female entitlement." No, Everything I'm saying is conditional on finding a wife who loves you and appreciates your sacrifices, like mine. And I'm very lucky. She's very rare. And that's why too few people are coupling up. But this is going to be a difficult conversation. The incentives of modernity, social media, smartphones, the economy, culture of liberal individualism, has parasitized tendencies in human nature, distorted them beyond all proportion, and now turned them against each other in regards to men and women. And one of the worst examples of this was a paper that went semi-viral recently on the effects of winning the lottery on marriage, divorce, and having children, and the disparities between how men and women behave when they win that lottery. On pages 2 and 3, it says, in our main analyses, they study marriage for players unmarried at the time of winning, divorce for married players, and fertility for all players regardless of marital status over 3 event windows. The short run, 2 years after the lottery. The medium run, 5 years, and the long run, 10 years. Their analyses were conducted in a sample of both female and male players, and in a combined sample. In the pooled sample, lottery wealth increases the marriage probability and fertility rate in the short and median run, while the effect on divorce risk is statistically insignificant. But separate analyses of male and female winners suggest the effects in the pooled sample often mask interesting heterogeneity by gender. Among unmarried men, the estimate suggests that a lottery win equivalent to $140,000 increases the probability of marriage within a 5-year horizon by 4.7 percentage points, 30%. It also suggests when married men win the lottery, the windfall has a tendency to stabilize existing marriages. The risk of divorce in the 10 years following the lottery falls by 6% in this sample, 40% reduction. Lottery wealth also increases male fertility at all time horizons. 10 years after the lottery, male winners show a 13.5% increase in fertility. In contrast, the only exception to the pattern of null results for female winners is that lottery wealth almost doubles their short-term probability of divorce. One interpretation of the absence of a discernible long-run increase in divorce among these women is that wealth accelerates the dissolution of marriages that were already underway. So if you're a man and you win the lottery, you're more likely to get married if you want, your marriage is more likely to stabilize if you are married, and you're more likely to have more children. If you're a woman, you're more likely to get divorced. Lottery wealth has a positive effect on men's marriage formulation, while the effect for women is close to 0, and the lottery wealth increases the short-run divorce probability in the couples where the wives win, and reduces a long-term divorce probability in couples where the husband wins. So the increase in the availability of material resources affects a woman's loyalty to a given man negatively, whereas if men have more material resources, they pour them into providing for their family, and they have more kids. So, in a civilization where the material incentives are set up not only to treat everyone as a individualized producing and consuming unit, regardless of their gender, regardless of how they relate to one another, but actually inverts this economic dynamic and promotes women in the workplace above men to eliminate the mythical gender pay gap, and in fact has created a gender pay gap based on DEI hiring requirements, where now young women earn more than their young male counterparts at the precise fertility window where you'd actually need to couple up and it's easiest to have kids. This creates a system of perverse incentives where men and women are expected to form relationships outside of what is congruous with their nature. And so we wonder why fewer people are getting married, few people are staying married, few people are having children, and when they have children, fewer families are staying together than historical norms. The paper's authors attempt to explain this away by saying, in this case, our results will be consistent with men preferring to have more children than women. However, according to the OECD, the average ideal number of children in Sweden is similar for men and women, as we saw reported in the John Byrne Murdoch Financial Times article, suggesting there is no gender differences in preferences for children. Moreover, to the extent the effect on male fertility is explained by increased marriage formation and stability, the fertility response reflects a relaxed constraint rather than preferences for children. In addition, the larger gender differences in the fertility response we found for older winners could be due to declining female fertility with age. In sum, the gender differences we document may reflect the different constraints on fertility facing men and women, rather than differences in preferences for children. Sure, but our preferences are revealed by our behavior. We believe, not what we say, but what we constantly do. And so, in the absence of material privation, provided by a lottery win, our desires are revealed. And the desire that men have when they have an abundance of material resources is to get married, commit to one woman, and have lots of children. And the desire that increasingly women seem to have if they win the lottery or are the beneficiaries of redistributed resources by the state, or an abundance of attention thanks to social media, which therefore sets off your sort of tribal brain that I have lots of men that want to provide me with resources. The revealed preference of women who either have or anticipate an abundance of resources is to be non-committal, is to not have children, is to consume and expect to be taken care of by a never-ending procession of suitors and the state who has replaced your husband. And for more on this, I encourage everyone to go and listen to Dave Green's latest stream titled Communist Daughters after the Neutral Milk Hotel song. But in it, he discusses the animosity between men and women based on this idea of girl dollars and boy dollars. And he discussed this related to the recent hated TikTok of the Dinks, the dual income no kids couple, who decided to have a series of color-coordinated scrapbooks of photos from their trips abroad based on all the money that they saved by not having kids. And also a clip of a boomer who runs a financial show berating a guy for not wanting to marry a woman because she has thousands of dollars in college debt. And he said, you should marry her and pay off her debt anyway, even though it wouldn't be the other way around. Dave laid out that girl dollars are disposable income that women spend on self-care. Because in a tribal setting, once you've gathered all the resources that can provide for you and your baby, you can start sharing those resources out among your peer group to improve your social standing, to actually ensure that you have a long-term security, because you have a reservoir of goodwill in your community that you can draw from when your gathering exercise doesn't go so well, when you fall on hard times, when you're sick, when your infant needs more resources than another infant because they're developing or they're unwell. And boy dollars have their spending deferred until you have secured the long-term security of the tribe. This is equivalent to investing in a pension, ensuring that your mortgage is paid off, ensuring all the bills are paid, ensuring you have a 1 to 2 year emergency fund. And then you can spend on your little hobbies and trinkets afterwards. Like, I don't know, buying a few comic books, or I can get myself a few extra plants or something. I don't do a lot of extracurricular spending. My wife doesn't do much for most women, but she certainly does spend impulsively. God love her. And so what's happened here is when you have just artificially injected billions of gold dollars into the economy through state subsidies, through DEI, and then you have also hypothetically promised more gold dollars via the attention economy, then women will spend a lot of that sort of surplus income, on self-care in the absence of having children that requires they prioritize the redistribution of resources to their dependents as caregivers. Men accrue resources and plan out for the future for when they have people relying on them, and women will spend on themselves in the absence of infants or the elderly relying on them. And so until that role is imposed upon women by the relationship choices they make, I'm not saying you impose being a mother on them via government fiat, alright? Calm down, put the Handmaid's Tale bonnets away. I know it's a fetish for you, but sorry to disappoint. Until that role in life, that movement from maiden to mother, as Louise Perry would say, until that has been achieved, then gold dollars will just be spent on frivolities, accumulating debt, participating in the attention economy, engaging in surrogate activities that distract you away from forming those relationships that allow you to go through life and enter that nest of concentric circles of meaningful relationships. Whereas men either accrue resources expecting to make the transition to father, pillar of the community, elder statesman. So they'll get their finances in order, they'll get their savings, they'll buy a house or rent an apartment, they'll get a good job, and they have to come presenting themselves as competent and with a wealth of resources ahead of meeting their prospective wife. They have to come to the date with their earnings already in shape. Men will either do that or, and I'm sure there are some of you in this audience, and I'm sorry if you're in this position, they have become so forlorn about the prospect of getting married and having their own family that now they have no reason to participate in that system that, like Atlas, is holding the world aloft on their shoulders. And so they're just spending their money on sort of like Reddit style knickknacks like Funko Pops or more LED lighting strips for their PC gaming rig. Or they're just living on the bare minimum. They're not striving, they're not working hard, they've got nobody to provide for, and so they're just living in the smallest apartment possible with an old TV propped up on a box and a mattress on the floor. They're living as if they are soldiers with no war to fight. Well, that's just a tragic existence. And so what Dave concluded in this podcast, and this, again, may be a very contentious topic, but he concluded that women don't always make the right choice when they make the most free choice. And that girl dollars do not purchase families. And so the solution to the fertility crisis, it will be systemic and economic. It will be transitioning away from this unsustainable boom and bust debt economy that indebts future generations that aren't even born yet, and myself, to pay for the inverted demographic pyramid of the larger elderly generation and all of the entitlement programs, pensions and healthcare spending that they voted for themselves without the prospect of ever actually paying for it. Of course it will be economic and material, but it will also be cultural. And it would also be a renegotiation of the relationships between men and women and how we show up for one another in society. And men will show up as protectors and providers, and women will have to show up not as consumers but as caregivers. And that will mean a reduction in the equal participation of the workforce. That will mean a rebalancing of the consideration we show to one another, of the social roles that we play. And that will be profoundly non-liberal. And any conversation about this will immediately invite accusations of, oh, you want to oppress women, you want to... I'm not talking in that frame. I'm talking in a frame, rather than reformatting our society according to an egalitarian ideology, I'm talking in a frame which addresses the concerns that men and women have, for example, that they feel unable to partner up and have families, and says, rather than acting in the interests of ideology, why don't we act in the interests of men and women, and do whatever furthers them towards that wholesome and nourishing goal. And so there will be people that watch this and pull what remains of their blue and pink dyed hair out. But I don't care. And I don't care for two reasons. Number one, because I don't want to see young people succumb to the tragedy of unplanned childlessness. I don't want them to be bereaved of families that might love and care for them, and that they will derive meaning from caring for. And also, I don't want my children to become a minority in their own country. I don't want them to be the only white kid in the class. That photo of Roger Scruton visiting the Michaela School is actually a vision of hell. I want them to grow up in a country that looks, that acts like them, and that they feel they belong in. And current trends, based on culture, based on politics, aren't going to provide that. So I am prepared to run whatever experiment that looks like it's going to work to ensure that we avoid that fate. And I think we all should be too, because otherwise our kids won't forgive us.